Okay, so I have Dr. Steve Watts with me here today. I'm sure he's known to the vast majority of you, very experienced police investigator, wrote manuals on murder investigations in healthcare settings. If you haven't seen his previous interviews on the channels, been interviewed by me, both on his own and with Stephanie Davies as well. So without further ado, I'll just say hello to Steve and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Chris. Good to see you again.
Yeah. So we've got many pages of used questions still left to ask you, but before we go into those questions, there has been this notable incident recently of Sir David Davis speaking in Parliament on the Cheshire Police investigation of that they dubbed Operation Hummingbird, and then a response from Mark Roberts, Chief Constable at Cheshire Constabulary, and then a response from Davis to them. So obviously, I'd love to. I mean, you've already very kindly given me a statement on this that I've read out, but firstly, I'd just like to ask for your opinion on David Davis's speech in Parliament.
I think it was a very, very important day for somebody as influential, as senior in Parliament as Sir David Davis to make such a speech and to draw attention to the issues around Operation Hummingbird and the concerns that a lot of us have, given the information is in the public domain. So I think it was a really, really important contribution that he made. And I think the points that he made were absolutely right, that there needs to be an examination of the investigation by an independent body, by the defence, just to establish exactly whether or not that investigation was conducted appropriately and how it contributed to Lucy Letby appearing in court.
So I'm going to ask you about Mark Roberts' response in a second, but firstly, what do you think about them saying we're not going to release the documents, basically?
Well, it's rather surprising, isn't it, that both the chief constable and the senior investigating officer on Operation Hummingbird have indicated on several occasions that they're open to scrutiny. They invite and they welcome challenge, and yet on the first occasion that they're invited to provide information which would allow that independent scrutiny, they're defensive and they refuse outright. Yeah, I mean that really concerns me. If, as they say, they believe the operation was conducted appropriately and in a broad-based, open-minded way, then I can't understand what the inhibition would be, what the problem would be in releasing that documentation for appropriate people to review it and come to a view as to whether or not that investigation was properly conducted.
Yeah, absolutely. So more broadly, um, I've already commented on this letter that Mark Roberts wrote. What did you make of the kind of tone of it and indeed the content?
I was really surprised, Chris, for somebody in his position to write a letter which was so aggressive and defensive to a senior member of Parliament, and in terms to suggest that that member of Parliament had misinformed, had misled Parliament. That's a really, really serious allegation. And I'm amazed that the Chief Constable would make that allegation. Sometimes with these things, I think, well, what would I have done in those circumstances? You know, I'd like to think that I'd have been polite, that I would have been professional. I would have understood that the member of Parliament had asked these questions. I would have made the point very clearly that I felt that the investigation had been properly conducted, and would have then perhaps indicated that there might be room, that there might be an opportunity under the proper circumstances, under controlled circumstances, for aspects of the investigation to be reviewed. I was just really concerned about the tenor and the tone of the letter. I was surprised.
Yeah, and one thing I said about it was that if you're going to make such serious allegations, I mean, it just doesn't seem well thought out at all because
No.
you're making very, as you said, rightly say, very serious allegations. So if you're going to do that, you want to be certain that you're on strong factual ground to begin with. And given that it was so easy to respond to that letter. And also, I know for a fact that parliamentary speech was very thoroughly researched. And I've fact checked it on this channel. Like every single aspect of it is just simply correct. So I think to come back in that way was incredibly misguided. Um, he would have been entitled to bite back a little bit, I suppose. But to say I expect an apology in Parliament from Sir David Davis, what, an apology for telling the truth? Absolutely
Well,
ridiculous.
exactly. I just can't understand, you know, why those who would be advising him would advise a response in those terms.
Hmm.
Um, the questions asked by Sir David Davis were reasonable. It's part of the function of Parliament to scrutinise public bodies. Um, Cheshire Constabulary and the Chief Constable are public servants, and they're accountable. They're accountable to the public. They're accountable to the local police and crime commissioner, and they're accountable to Parliament. And all Sir David Davis has asked is for an account of the way in which the investigation was conducted, because of concerns, significant concerns from myself and others, that from what we can see in the public domain, there may be issues with the investigation that may have affected the trial. That's all we're saying, and all we're asking for is sight of those documents, those key documents that can answer that question one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to get into now questions. So I have several pages of questions from viewers, and I haven't made any organization regarding how I'm going to ask these questions. So I'll just ask them to you randomly because many of these are very valid questions. We've waited, so much has happened in such a short period of time that some of these questions are now obsolete. For example, there's a question here about the Crown Prosecution Service threatening to bring further charges against Lucy that's now a bit defunct because we know we've already kind of commented on that. But the first question I'm going to ask you here is that Dr. Watts says he has testified in court as senior investigating officer, re the conduct of investigations, exclusion of alternative hypotheses, etc. Presumably, this was at the invitation of the prosecution. Should any conclusions be drawn, however tentatively, when the prosecution does not do this, as it did not in Lucy's case, to what extent is it standard practice and to be expected that the prosecution will do this?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, on a number of occasions in Crown Court trials, as the senior investigating officer, I've been asking, as your correspondent there properly indicates, that was at the invitation of the prosecution, to give an account of how I led the investigation, how the investigation was conducted, and in particular, whether we followed every line of inquiry, because the assertion being made by the prosecution on the occasions I gave evidence was that we'd focused very narrowly on their client, on the defendant. And I was put to the test of demonstrating that the investigation had been broad-based, had followed all reasonable lines of inquiry, had developed hypotheses, one of which was that their client was the offender, and we tested those hypotheses against the evidence that we had in the investigation. And that happened to me and to colleagues up and down the country on numerous occasions and still does. Whether it should be mandatory on every occasion, I don't think you can say that with criminal trials. Each must be decided on its own merits. There are going to be some trials where it's not going to be relevant to call the senior investigating officer because the conduct of the investigation is not a matter of issue. Both sides accept that the investigation was as it was, and they're content with the way that the facts have been brought to the court. But on the occasions, as I say, when I've been asked to give evidence as a senior investigating officer, there have been questions on the part of the prosecution as to the not really the integrity, but the effectiveness, if you like, and the rigorousness of the investigation, and whether or not, as I said, we particularly focused on one individual, their client, to the exception of other people who may well have been suspects. So whilst I wouldn't say that it was necessary in every case, certainly if there is a query in relation to the way the investigation was conducted, then then it's right that that the SIO give evidence. And I was quite surprised in Lucy Letby's case that there were clearly at the time of the trial issues around the way the investigation was conducted. And I was surprised I didn't see any indication that the SIO was asked to give an account of the way that he had led the investigation.
Yeah. So there's a follow-up question here, which is just simply, do you think it should be standard practice? I mean, should it be mandatory for the SIO to give evidence? You know, not always, obviously, but perhaps in more complex cases, if that could be defined somehow.
Well, as I just said, each case has got to be taken on its merits as to whether or not the defence have concerns about whether the investigation has been properly conducted. So there are, the vast majority of cases, there isn't going to be that concern. Both the prosecution and the defence are going to be content with the way that the matters have been put before the court. But there's a significant minority of cases where there are concerns raised by the defence about the way the investigation is conducted. Suggestions, as I say, around focusing on their client to the exception of other potential suspects, etc. But the court to say it should be mandatory and mandatory in particular in relation to serious cases, I'm not sure that's realistic, to be honest.
That's fair. Let's talk about the interviewing of Lucy Letby. So we know that Daniel Stonier conducted 2/3 effectively of Lucy's interviews in 2019, 2020, while by that stage she'd already been a family liaison officer for 2 years, very much embedded with the parents of the infants. So there's just a question here about, is that appropriate? Surely that would introduce confirmation bias into the process immediately.
There's a couple of things in relation to the investigative interviewing. I'll just leave the issue around the family liaison officer to one side at the moment. I think there needs to be, as part of the overall review of the investigation, which I think is important, I think there needs to be a review of the way the interviews were conducted. There are very, very clear guidelines in policing now, and I worked on those whilst I was in the police service at the senior level, in relation to the way that interviews are prepared and conducted and evaluated. And I'm not sure that review has been done, and I think there's a real need to do that, given the length and the intensive nature of those reviews, and the way in which the dynamic throughout the interview changed, and whether or not that was appropriate, and how that impacted upon Lucy Letby's account. There have been all sorts of comments around her making no comment, and of course, that's entirely her prerogative, the prerogative of anybody who's being interviewed under caution by the police. But when you look more closely, you can see those no comment responses were towards the end of the phases of interviews, and were potentially in relation to repetitive questioning. So those are issues that I think need to be looked at. As for the use of somebody who had previously been a family liaison officer on the investigation, I was surprised to see that. It's not unknown for people who've been family liaison officers to also be the interviewing officer in an investigation, but often those are investigations where there are limited resources, i.e. there are so few investigators on a case that people have to take dual roles. And people who are properly briefed, and the issues are reasonably straightforward, can take on those interview roles. But that wasn't the case in Operation Hummingbird. We know that Operation Hummingbird was very well resourced. It was recognised as being a very significant case at a national level. There was additional funding, I understand, from the Home Office to support the investigation. So they weren't scratching around looking for people to fill in roles. So I'd be really interested to see the decision log of the senior investigating officer, to see the recommendations of the interview coordinator. There will have been an interview coordinator and somebody there making decisions, planning the interviews, and getting those plans approved by the senior investigating officer. So there's a sophisticated process behind it. And I'd be interested to see those documents as to what the decision making was around introducing somebody who had been a family liaison officer um, to act as the interviewing officer. Because, as you say, there are real issues around whether or not anybody in that position, can be truly unbiased in the way they conduct that role as an investigator, having worked so very closely with members of the family in those circumstances. So I think there are real questions around there that need to be looked at as part of the overall review.
Yes. So I have a few follow-up questions. So my first observation would be I absolutely accept what you're saying that there can be circumstances where it's justified. But the problem for me would always be this was such an emotional situation where these parents had gone from already obviously being sad about the passing of their infants in some cases to being told, we think someone has harmed your infant, to, as far as we can see from the Operation Hummingbird film, to being convinced by the fact that police are there that someone maybe has harmed their infant, and then increasingly it seems that they're feeding them information to say, yeah, we're pretty confident now that someone has harmed your infant, and then this person is managing all this emotional journey they're going on, and then they stick her in front of the defendant. The only person, as we know, they ever interviewed in those circumstances, even though they made this spurious claim like, oh, that was the only way we could have interviewed her that we've dealt with previously. That to me is all very, very troubling.
Yeah, I agree. And the cases I'm speaking about are more straightforward cases where, I wouldn't be surprised for that to happen. But you're right, in these particular circumstances, with, the emotions as they would have been, and you talk through that roller coaster of working with the parents and giving them information and supporting them through the investigation, to then be asked to conduct the interview. Is a really big issue, and that's why I say I'd be really interested to see why that decision was made, because that's not just happenstance. That's not just a matter of that particular individual being in the office at the time the interview is going to take place. Somebody's made a decision, and the people who've made that decision are the interview coordinator and the senior investigating officer. They've decided to put that person in the interview at that time. There must be some rationale behind it. I'm at a loss to understand what terms of why they thought the interview may be conducted more effectively, more appropriately by doing that. So that's why, again, it's so important for the defence or an independent body to see that documentation to understand whether that was the right decision, and if it wasn't the right decision, how that might have detrimentally impacted upon the investigation.
Yeah. So the other question I want to ask you as a follow-up to your previous answer, it is one that this only needs a very brief answer. I think the answer is quite obvious, really. But today is, as I'm recording this, Amanda Knox has appeared on Good Morning Britain, and I was just having a quick look at the comments, and one of the comments references the fact that Lucy said no comment in the interviews. Now, we know for a fact, an absolute fact, that I mean, you've already said she's perfectly entitled to say no comment. That's another matter entirely. But we also know for a fact she was incredibly cooperative. She answered every single police interview we've got. There's no indication she ever said no comment. And even if that has been edited out, which I'm doubtful that it has, because it all follows logically. But even if it has, it would have been an incredibly small percentage of what happened, if it even happened at all. And yet, in that documentary, Cheshire Police, who, as far as we know, were centrally involved in it, they tried to give the impression that Lucy said no comment a lot and that Lucy tried to duck questions. Now, I think I think the right word for me would be despicable. But I just wondered if you had a comment on it, really.
Yeah, I do. And the selection of those excerpts from the interviews, don't, I think, show a true record, a true representation of how she responded during interviews. As you say, our understanding is that on most occasions she gave full answers and responses and did her best to give a full account in relation to the questions she was being asked. My understanding is that the no comments that she did make were right towards the end of the sequence, the very, very long sequence of interviews that she underwent on three separate occasions. And to be honest, the questions by that point were becoming repetitive, and could be argued to be onerous and perhaps even overbearing, given the repetitive nature of those questions. So I wouldn't be surprised if a solicitor didn't advise her to make no comment, because you've got to get to a position where, if you've given an answer on one or two occasions and you're being asked the same question again, is it reasonable to keep giving the same response over and over again? So that's why I say we need to see those full interviews, and somebody who understands, the process of investigative interviewing and the regime under which it's performed across England and Wales needs to review those interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a few more questions I want to ask here that I've highlighted. The first one is, we've discussed this kind of already about the documentation being disclosed. I mean, can Cheshire Police just continue to deadbat this, to block it? Do they ultimately have the right to do this? Is that legitimate, I suppose?
My understanding of the legislation is that they can, in fact, that right up until conviction, they have an obligation to respond to the defence at all stages, and produce to them any documentation that's asked for. But after conviction, that requirement evaporates. However, there is a public interest issue here, isn't there? We've got a lot of questions being asked in relation to the conduct of the investigation and how that may have affected a potential miscarriage of justice. And those questions are being asked by some pretty significant people, including, a senior member of Parliament. The organisation itself, Cheshire Constabulary, have said that they are open, that they invite scrutiny and welcome challenge. And yet they're still saying they're not going to release any of this documentation. I think that's really regrettable. If they release the documentation that's been asked for, that would demonstrate very, very quickly to experienced people who understood what they were looking at, whether the investigation had been conducted properly and effectively in accordance with the legislation, guidance and best practice. And Cheshire Constabulary would be in a position of being able to say, well, our view was that this was an appropriate investigation, and now we've demonstrated it by being open and welcoming of scrutiny. But they're not doing that. So as it stands, I'm not aware of any legislation that can compel them to produce those documents, except the Criminal Cases Review Commission. If the Criminal Cases Review Commission took the view that in order to discharge their role, they needed to see that documentation, they needed to conduct a review of the investigation itself, then they could do that. So they had legislation that could compel Cheshire Constabulary to release that documentation to them so that they can decide whether or not the investigation was conducted appropriately and whether or not it contributed to a miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, absolutely. So a follow-up question I have here is, does Dr. Watts think it would be useful if police forces had a duty to disclose such material to the defence, i.e. not only disclose it on request, but in any event? Would the knowledge that it would be disclosed help to maintain and or drive up police standards, both in the decision-making process and in the documentation of it?
Well, there is an obligation to disclose to the defence at all stages, right up until conviction. So there's no question there. So the police have a duty under the Criminal Procedures and Investigation Act and the Attorney General's guidelines to retain all material that is generated during the investigation. So that's anything, whether it be documentary, whether it be witness statements, whether it be notes or physical evidence, to retain that. to record it, to make a record of the fact they got it, and to categorise it, i.e., to I decide whether or not it's material that is going to be part of the evidence itself, whether or not the material is of a sensitive nature, whether it needs to be disclosed to the defence because it tends to undermine the prosecution case or support the defence case, and to provide that list to the defence. And with the use of that list, the defence can then request any other material that they think may be helpful. So all throughout the process, from the moment a person is charged through to the moment that they're convicted, there is that obligation on the police service. But once the conviction has been made, then that obligation is not in place.
Yeah, and I think the second half of the question was if the, you obviously mentioned the kind of legislative obligations, but could this help? I think the question was, could this help with decision making if, in the case of Operation Hummingbird, if they were examined more at this stage, perhaps, and there was more disclosure, could that help them improve the decision making and investigative?
Well, okay, so already the disclosure throughout the criminal process, the investigative and the prosecution process, does focus minds in policing. It's made investigations far more professional because police forces know, investigators know that everything that is done and said is going to be retained and is going to be available for the defence and for the court and other tribunals. So that's an important thing in driving up professionalism in criminal investigation. As to whether or not it should be available after conviction, I think it should be, because then we wouldn't be in the position that we are now, where the defence and legitimate commentators have asked for a review of the investigation, and that's being resisted. I can accept to a certain extent the position of the police in relation to wanting to avoid frivolous attempts to get information after conviction, because that would be very laborious, very onerous on police forces. Every time someone's convicted, then along came a group of people to say, well, let's now look at all the defence, all the material that wasn't provided, just so they can go on a fishing exercise to see whether or not there's any evidence there that there might be a miscarriage. I'm not suggesting we get into that situation, but where there is proper concern, where clearly you have a defence who are working towards having a case reviewed by the CCRC and or the Court of Appeal, then there should be a mechanism for a police force to be held to account to the extent that they provide the documentation that can give an insight into the way the investigation was conducted and whether that investigation may have led to a miscarriage. The material is there. Most of it is available electronically. They could give a link to proper individuals who had the experience and understanding to review that material, and it could be done. It surprises me that if they think that their investigation was as robust, as wide-ranging and appropriate as they do, that they're not willing to do that at this stage, because clearly this isn't going to go away. And if I was in their position, I'd be thinking very strongly about, well, we know that the investigation was conducted properly. We may as well just give access. We make sure that access is given to properly accredited people, whether that be another police force that's nominated to come and do a review, which is a normal process that happens all the time in criminal investigations, or whether it be the CCRC, or whether it be independent people appointed by the defence. It's not difficult to do, and I think it's of real concern that people are behaving in such an aggressively defensive way.
Yeah, I agree. So I've got a question here that requires a degree of speculation, perhaps, but it is simply, I would love to know how Cheshire Police are reflecting on their investigation and behaviour. What does Steve think is happening at the moment? And I suppose an obvious parallel question would be not how are they reflecting, but how should they be reflecting on their investigation?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that there is a strategic gold group in place within Cheshire Constabulary, and that would be a group that would be chaired by a chief officer, so an assistant chief constable, a deputy, or the chief constable, because this is clearly an issue which has the potential to impact upon the reputation of the organisation. It's a critical incident as defined within policing. So they'll be looking at all the aspects of the criticism and the concerns that are being raised, and deciding on what their actions are going to be, what their response should be. So the response to Sir David Davis's speech should have gone through that body. It should have been discussed, and the options for how to respond to it should have been discussed. And if that was all done, then that would have resulted in the letter that the chief constable sent. That's the process, and paramount of the highest priority for the police in taking that process forward is transparency, openness, and integrity. It's going to demonstrate, because they're a publicly accountable body, that they acted appropriately, and that their response is as open and as transparent as is possible. So that's why I'm particularly surprised that the outcome is letters of the type that have been sent back to David Davis, and the comments about people who are raising those concerns have been made in such pejorative terms. I mean, I think that's really, really inappropriate.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to feel that they're under attack, understandably.
Yeah, and I think we should cut them a little bit of slack in that regard. I mean, it must be fairly unpleasant,
Oh, yeah.
even though it's deserved. It's absolutely deserved. But you
Yeah.
know, no one would like to be in that situation, would they?
No, absolutely, absolutely, and I can empathise and sympathise with people in that position. And as I've said many occasions, I don't think anyone here, anyone in the police service, set out to do anything untoward or inappropriate. I think they were all working really, really hard to do their best to support the families, to conduct an investigation that they thought was thorough and appropriate. But we're in the position where we are, where others are raising concerns around the way that investigation was conducted for all the right reasons, and are asking for reassurance, for material to be provided that can give reassurance to demonstrate those concerns, are not founded. That's all that's being asked. So I can understand their concerns. Nobody's made any suggestion, that I've been part of, that there's been any wrongdoing or any dishonesty. I think people were working really, really hard in difficult circumstances to do the best job they could. The outcome, in my opinion, and the opinion of others, is that there may have been a miscarriage of justice in this case. And that's what people's motivation is. The people that I've worked with in this regard, that's their motivation. It's not to attack individuals or organisations. It's about examining the perspective that there's been a serious miscarriage of justice here. And if there is, then it needs to be surfaced and it needs to be dealt with through the court.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question here about kind of internal matters at the Cheshire Police. Again, this is somewhat half of this question is somewhat speculative, and the other half is not. Um, do you feel other members of Hummingbird would have serious concerns at this point? And also, is there a whistleblowing route that police can use to raise such concerns?
Yeah, there may well be. There may well have been people during the investigation that might have been concerned that the investigation is going in the wrong direction, or that assumptions were being made that were inappropriate. Um, um, and that may be the case now. There may be people who reflected on the investigation and potentially their part in it, have concerns. yes, there is a whistleblowing procedure in the police, as in all other public bodies in the United Kingdom, and that would be available to them. And one hopes that if somebody raised concerns through that avenue, that they would be properly supported, and those concerns would be investigated and surfaced as appropriate.
Yeah, that seems fair. Um, Another question here on the relationship between Cheshire Police and the press. So we'll deal with the second question, the first question second. But let's firstly talk about the relationship between Cheshire Police and the Daily Mail, particularly between um, Liz Hull, Caroline Cheetham, and the various people that become prominent. Paul Hughes is one of the most notable, but there are others as well. Um, I think most would say it's described here as a cozy relationship between Cheshire Police and this publication in particular. Um, do you have any thoughts about that and its appropriateness, I guess?
Well, yeah, I mean the Daily Mail have been, at the forefront of covering the whole trial, and indeed it's why I've become involved. I recall listening to the Daily Mail podcast regularly as the trial went forward, and it was an important source of information for me in understanding, what the issues were in relation to the case, and that's entirely appropriate. Um, it does seem now to me that they seem to have moved from reporting the case to being on something of a crusade in relation to the supporting the prosecution and the convictions, and that's fine. That's an entirely legitimate position for them to take. I'm not sure that I have all the information I need to understand how close the relationship between them and Cheshire Police is or has been in order to judge whether that's appropriate or not. But it is important for police forces and for the police force generally, police service generally, to be even-handed with news organisations. And, it's really important to make sure that information is given to all news organisations and not isolated to particular individual news outlets. There was some conversation I've seen in relation to the most recent letter from the Chief Constable, and that potentially being handed to the Daily Mail prior to other news organisations or whatever. And I'm not aware of, the provenance of that, but it underlines the importance of the police acting even-handedly with the press. In terms of how close the police are to the press, it's important that there's a positive relationship between the police and the press and individual journalists. The media need information in order to provide stories, in order to inform the public, and the police need the media and the press to get their message across, to demonstrate what they're doing to protect individuals and communities, which is their job, and in order to explain police actions and police operations. So there's always that interface between the police and the press, which, if operated effectively and properly, is a benefit to both sides, and most importantly, is a benefit to the public and the community in understanding the police and understanding the judicial process, and that's really important. The concern arises, and there have been many other cases. I'm not referring now to Operation Hummingbird, but there have been other cases over the years where there have been issues around the relationship between the police and the press. We think back to the so-called phone hacking scandals and those sorts of things, where it's demonstrated the dangers. But it's important that when it works properly, it's a benefit to the public to understand how policing is operated and understand particular cases individually.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about this press conference that occurred? I don't. Do you know anything about that before I go any further?
Yeah, all I know about it, Chris, is
Yeah.
that there was a press conference prior to the convictions or the prior to the decision of the jury being known. Um, I understand there's some debate as to whether or not that only involves certain outlets or is only offered to certain outlets, but I'm not sure of the accuracy of that.
I think it's fairly sound because Peter Hitchens, one of the best known journalists in the country, frankly, has complained about this and said, "Why wasn't I told about it? Why wasn't I allowed to
Yeah,
attend?" and so forth.
yeah.
Um,
Well, if he wasn't and he wanted to, or if he asked and he wasn't allowed to, then that would be a real big concern. In
hmm,
terms of these sorts of conferences taking place, I mean they're quite common. I mean I've been
yeah,
involved in them myself in large cases, complex cases. It's entirely appropriate for the police to give a briefing under an embargo to the press where they explain aspects of the case, aspects of the prosecution, so that at the time the verdicts come in, the press aren't then just running around trying to get that information at a time that can be very, very stressful, in terms of dealing with, the families, dealing with, the sentencing, etc., etc. So, it's important, in order to properly allow the media to do its job and give a clear account of the case and clear account of the consequences of the verdict either way, that they're given these briefings. But as I said, those briefings should be open to all media outlets, and work should be done to ensure that anybody who might have a legitimate interest as a media, as a journalist, to be invited and to be able to attend. So, if that wasn't the case, that would be of significant concern.
yeah. I think I should say as well to viewers that there are obviously reasonable criticisms that can be made of this, but one thing you have to remember is that Cheshire Police thought they were right. They thought they were correct. They thought their investigation was entirely sound. And it's easy to look back at some of these things in retrospect and think that's suspicious, or they were trying to, put a certain narrative across to prevent the other narrative coming out. They thought 100% that Lucy Letby was guilty, and they believed that
Yeah,
they'd done the right thing.
yeah.
So when they held this press conference, it wasn't some, you know, like secret society type thing where they were keeping keeping the real information away and putting the false information out or anything like that. They thought they were right. And I think it's important to
Absolutely,
say that.
absolutely, and there's nothing I've seen that suggests they were knowingly doing the wrong thing.
Mm.
And as you say, I'm absolutely sure that they were convinced that what they had done a full and appropriate investigation, and that the person guilty of these offences was Lucy Letby. There's no doubt in my mind of that. Um, but what I see from the material that's available in the public domain is that there's a very strong potential that they were affected by biases, particularly confirmation bias. And the important thing about confirmation bias is that we're affected by it every day as individuals, and we don't see it. It's an unconscious bias.
Mm.
That's the very reason that it's as dangerous as it is, because in day-to-day decision makings, we make mistakes all the time because of confirmation bias, but it doesn't affect us very much. But in a case like this, given the issues, given the stakes involved, mistakes made by confirmation bias can have disastrous implications, as we believe that they had in this case. So I'm absolutely convinced that they believe they've done the right thing. They believe that the evidence they acquired demonstrated Lucy Letby's guilt. But my perception is, based upon the information I've seen, is that they're operating with very significant confirmation bias. They had made a decision at a very early stage that Lucy Letby was the killer, and they gathered evidence to demonstrate to the court that hypothesis was correct, and they were successful in doing that. Personally, I think they were wrong, but I don't think that they were doing the wrong thing.
Hi everyone. So that unfortunately was the final answer that I was able to derive from Dr. Watts because Zoom crashed after that. I'm sure I don't know if how many of you have conducted Zoom conversations, probably most of you. I'm sure you've all had that experience where suddenly someone's bar goes red and you can't record anything properly. So unfortunately, we could never get the. I tried turning off the video, just recording audio, and that made absolutely no difference. It was completely unusable. And we tried a little bit for a few minutes. There was nothing we could do, so I said, the best thing to do, I don't want to waste your time, is just to terminate at this point. So we did have many questions that I wanted to ask, which we were unable to ask. But the good news is I can use those questions again at a future date. I'm sure Steve will join us again in the future, and I still have those questions. No doubt there'll be more questions that will come up. So if you do have any, please do leave them in the comments. I will just reflect on the fact that ironically, when we were recording with him in Australia, it worked a lot better than it did in this country, but what can you do? Um, so yeah, sorry about that, but there's still a good 45 minutes of audio and video, and we'll be able to record more in the future. This is just one of those technical issues that I couldn't do anything about. Wouldn't even have a clue what to do. Don't think you can do anything if someone's internet is dropping. What can you do? So I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I'm hopeful that I'll be able to join this. I don't know why I put the water bottle in the way, but I'm hopeful that I'll be able to join this with the existing video and give you a bit of an explanation. But thank you for your support. If you have any questions, queries, please do let me know.